So you've got your podcast recorded and now you want to make it sound smooth and professional. In this video, I'm going to show you a couple of podcast recordings and I'm going to go over how to use EQ and compression to make them sound professional and awesome and to fix any issues that might be present. Before we dive into this mix, I just want to point out that it's important to start off with a really good high quality recording. The mixing can improve a bad recording, we can fix some issues, but if you're recording yourself, it's important to learn how to get a great recording first. I know you're not always going to have control over that though, especially if your guests are recording their end of the podcast, for example. And either way, I would say that every single vocal recording for a podcast will need some EQ and some compression to some extent. Okay, so we've got a vocal recording from the Recruitment Mentors podcast here. It sounds good. I'm going to hit play in a second. It's a little bit echoey, a little bit reverby. So we're going to try and do some EQ cuts to help fix that. But generally, it does sound nice. So you're going to see what I do with an EQ and compressor on a generally well-recorded vocal.
Listen, so what we will go over is your leadership journey, because I think that's a really common challenge for people. And then we'll talk a bit about the business strategy or whatever, because I do.
So you can hear a little bit of echo there. It's been recorded in an office. I'm going to be using this Pro Tools channel strip. You can use any EQ or compressor you like. I just like this one for simple things like this because it's got everything in one place. So for the EQ, there are 3 to 4 changes generally that I'll make. The first thing I'll be doing is putting in a high pass filter to cut out a bunch of the low end. Now this isn't bass that you can really hear. It's the sub bass. And the very low bass that is just rumble. It's just unwanted low end energy, and it helps reduce some of the kind of plosive and breathiness that you get from a lot of podcast recordings. So let's just bring it in up to around
your leadership journey, because I think that's a really common challenge for people. And then we'll talk a bit about the business strategy or whatever, because I do feel like there's a bit more to it than what you just said.
So if you go too far, it starts getting thin and horrible, but right from the beginning, and then moving it just up to around 70, 80 hertz, it doesn't remove anything of value.
Let's unpack this then. So what we will go over is your leadership journey, because I think that's a really common challenge for people.
And then the second thing I want to do is reduce a little bit of the low mids, which is low mids around sort of 300 to around 1K. That's normally where you find a lot of this reverb, the echoiness that you don't normally want in there. So let's just sweep around there and see what sounds bad, basically. If we bring that up and just tighten the cue a little bit.
Your leadership journey, because I think that's a really common challenge for people. And then we'll talk a bit about the business strategy or whatever, because I do feel like there's a bit more to it than what you just said. But I get your point.
Yeah, so that's where you're getting that kind of that echoey noise there. Let's bring that down.
The business strategy or whatever, because I do feel like there's a bit more to it than what you just said. But I get your point. I get your point entirely. But what?
And it just generally makes a nice, richer, more pleasant sounding tone as well to the voice. So even if it wasn't reverby, I'd probably do a bit of that. There are de-reverb plugins, but they normally affect the fidelity of the recording. They don't sound as good quality after, so I tend to avoid those unless it's really bad in terms of the reverb. But let's just bypass that and then turn it on. You can hear the difference with just those 2 changes so far.
Your leadership journey, because I think that's a really common challenge for people. And then we'll talk a bit about the business strategy or whatever, because I do feel like there's a bit more to it than what you just said.
So sounding a little bit more intimate, a little bit warmer as well. But first, let's finish EQing this. The next change that I often make is just adding a little bit of bass. Past that really low bass, just a little bit of body there around 100 hertz. Now these settings aren't going to be the same for every vocal recording, so you need to listen for the change it makes rather than focus too much on these specific numbers.
The business strategy or whatever, because I do feel like there's a bit more to it than what you just said.
Just a nice bit.
But I get your point. I get your point entirely. But what I just wanted to focus on very quickly is
about 4 to 5 dB boost there. Now it gives it a more kind of broadcasty nature, just a little bit of warmth, and again it just sounds nicer. And then what I often do is give a little boost at the top there just to crisp things up, but it depends on the recording. If it's too bright already, I wouldn't be doing that.
Your leadership journey, because I think that's a really common challenge for people, and then we'll talk a bit about the business strategy or whatever, because I do feel like there's a bit more to it than what you just said. But I get your point. I get your point entirely. But what I just wanted to focus on very quickly
bring that mid
is
down a bit more.
You sort of saying you
Tighten
building up desks for people and doing that on repeat, right? So a lot of people listen to this.
Now let's compare the two.
We'll talk a bit about the business strategy or whatever, because I do feel like there's a bit more to it than what you just said. But I get your point. I get your point entirely. But what I just wanted to focus on very quickly is you sort of saying you building up desks for people and doing that on repeat, right? So a lot of people listen to this, may have come into the recruitment industry.
So it's sounding richer, warmer, more professional. This is generally the kind of EQ curve that I'll be starting with, but it really depends on the recording. You've got to listen to the recording specifically. Now let's have a think about what we're going to do compression wise. So just in case you're not completely sure, compression, what it's doing is going to be reducing the level of the loud bits, like this laugh here.
But I get your.
No, it was, but I get your point. So it gets a bit loud there, especially for people wearing headphones. It's a bit intrusive. What the compressor is going to do is bring those down, those loud peaks, and leave the quieter bits how they are. So it's just generally going to smooth the overall level. So I'm going to focus on this section here mainly, because it's really clear what we're trying to do there. So I want to bring the threshold down. So it's the compressor is only kicking in, it's only reducing the level once the level goes over a certain threshold. And that threshold is around there where it peaks. So we can bring that threshold back, that line there, and you'll see it's going to start reducing the level on that bit there.
Business strategy or whatever, because I do feel like there's a bit more to it than what you just said. But I get your point. I get your point. So
it's reducing it a lot heavier. You can look at this dB gain reduction meter as well, and you'll see that it's dropping it by about 3 dB when it gets to that loud bit.
But I get your point.
Okay, and then the ratio setting is how much it's reducing it by. So if we set it to around 3:1, it's going to be reducing the level by 3 decibels for every 1 decibel that goes over the threshold. That's quite a low ratio, low to medium. If you're mixing a song where the vocals are over music, then I'd normally go a bit higher on the ratio there. But because the vocals are on their own, if you go too hard on the compression, it's going to be obvious and it's going to sound squashed and unnatural. So now we've got a bit more compression going. Let's hit play. And then I'm just going to use this knee setting so it's not so sudden, the change in level.
Business strategy or whatever, because I do feel like there's a bit more to it than what you just said. But I get your point. I get your point
so
entirely.
It's reducing
but
that
what I just
by
wanted
6
to focus
dB
on
now. Let's compare the two with and without the compression.
A bit more to it than what you just said. But I get your point. I get your point than what you just said. But I get your point. I get your point entirely. But what I just wanted to focus.
It's so much nicer to listen to. It's going to keep things smoothed out, and we do exactly the same thing on the other channel as well to keep the whole thing nice and balanced. I'll just briefly go over the attack and release in case your compressor has these settings as well. The attack is how fast the compressor is going to kick in, and to be honest, it sounds good when it's kicking in quite fast. So I'm not going to have it quite there. I'm going to bring it back to about half a millisecond, really fast attack. And then the release is how quickly it's going to be going back to uncompressed after that bit. And it sounds quite nice and smooth with a relatively long release there. We don't want it to sound obvious again because the vocal's on its own.
The business strategy or whatever, because I do feel like there's a bit more to it than what you just said. But I get your point. I get your point entirely. But what I just wanted to focus on very quick.
Yeah, they're sounding really smooth. Now we're quickly going to have a look at the guest vocal as well. Often you'll find that the guests in podcast recordings, they're not going to have recorded their vocal quite as well. If they're not used to guesting on podcasts, or if they don't have one themselves, they might not have the right equipment. So you can see there are huge spikes in level here, and we're going to have to go a bit harder on the compression. So let's just go straight to compression first, because I really want to have a listen to that and sort it out.
I'm still very hands-on in account development and business.
Yeah, so it really spikes. We're going to go harder on the ratio here. I'm going to go to around 5 or 6. Fast attack, faster release, because it seems to be picking up these spikes that are much louder than the rest, and I don't want the compression, this heavy compression, to continue for a long time after that spike. So I'm going to go faster and release.
I'm still very hands-on in account development and business development. So what I do now is when I hire somebody, I tend to give them 6 months, no real target, because we're a bit more forgiving at Bright Purple. So I give them 6 months to get up and running. After month 4, if they're a trainee consultant,
there we go. So it's really compressing it heavy now, because we've got that higher ratio. It's dropping it by around 6 to 9 dB on those spikes, but that's exactly what we want. It sounds natural still. It just is more pleasant for the listener. And let's just go for another EQ on this one. There's a little bit of buzzing in the background. I'd probably be using RX denoise on that, the isotope plugin, to try and get rid of it. But we're going to see if we can do anything with EQ.
I tend to give them 6 months, no real target, because we're a bit more forgiving at Bright Purple. So I give them 6 months to get up and running. After month 4, if they're a trainee consultant,
it's around there. I can hear that buzzing in the background when you get to around there. So that works quite nicely, actually, because I want to reduce some of that anyway.
I tend to give them 6 months, no real target, because we're a bit more forgiving at Bright Purple. So I give them 6 months to get up and running. After month 4, if they're a trainee consultant, within the 4 months they've joined, will usually sign 10 clients or something silly like that, a large number, and then I take those clients and then I account develop with them as a resource, and I CC them in, and I slowly CC myself out and let them run the account. So I do that on repeat now. So I just build desks on repeat for business development. That's what I do. I go out on an elephant hunt, SME, win spot business.
Okay, so that's sounding a lot better. I'd be using a de-esser on this as well, maybe a vocal rider, just different kinds of plugins that are going to help get a great sound. But whatever you're mixing your podcast with, it might not have these plugins. And even if you don't have them, you can still get a fantastic sound with a good recording, an EQ, and a compressor. So now we've got a really great sounding podcast. Let me know in the comments section below, how do you process your podcast vocals? And has watching this video changed your mind about anything at all, or given you some pointers? It'd be great to know if this has helped you out. And for more vocal mixing tips and advice, just hit that subscribe button. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.